Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wolfson College. Welcome to the Oxford Centre for Life Writing and to one of our new initiatives and programs, which I'll say a few words about in a moment. My name is Elika Burma, and I'm the Executive Director of OCLU and the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, the acronym that we'd like to sound in that way. And it's my great pleasure to introduce and to chair this lecture by Santanu Das, The Maritime Closet, Queer Lives Before the Mast Today. This is a new pivot in Santanu's work. It's one that he's been anticipating for a while and giving us kind of tasty tasters of, and I'm kind of really delighted that he's brought this substantial lecture here to OCLU today. Just a kind of, just an opening, which is from Santanu himself. Naval tradition, Winston Churchill was said to have growled, "Monstrous, nothing but rum, sodomy, and the lash." And taking that as a kind of provocation, Santanu is going to seek in this talk to uncover and examine the much mythologized yet largely unknown world aboard what Herman Melville, who's the focus today, called the wooden-walled Gomorrahs of the deep, and the relationship of these to literary and cultural forms. I think some of the questions that Santanu is driving at, both in this talk and in the larger project, is how we create a queer archive, how we create and curate and indeed define a queer archive. And is there something that we might, through that archival work, start to call a maritime closet? Please do come in. If much attention in recent years has been on the discursive and the political, in this talk, Santanu is going to highlight some of the perverse impulses and pleasures, the dissident pleasures of queer lives and literature in an increasingly sanitized critical culture. And actually, Santanu and I were just talking a moment ago about trigger warnings, which I'll leave him to say more about. An important word about our OCLU's Global Majority and Underrepresented Writers program. Here at OCLU, from the very beginning, from when we began, we have championed a range of voices and stories, creating spaces where writers and researchers, do come in please, all welcome, can explore the many ways lives are told and imagined. And our Global Majority and Underrepresented Writers program builds on that commitment by offering structured support for talented writers from communities that remained underrepresented in publishing and in the academy. The program, which we're just starting out with now, provides mentorship, skills development, and a sustaining community to help writers explore, investigate, and strengthen their practice and navigate the world of life writing. And lectures such as this inaugural lecture of Santanu's, this kind of opening out the new program, are really helpful, I think, to set some keynotes, to platform established global majority and underrepresented writers, and also to open dialogue across experiences, backgrounds, genres, and forms. So I can't think of a better person to talk to us today, kind of under that rubric, than Santanu Das. Professor Das is Senior Research Fellow and Professor of Modern Literature and Culture at All Souls College here at Oxford. He's the author of 2 award-winning, garlanded monographs, Touch and Intimacy in First World War Literature. I think one of the most beautifully written works of literary criticism that I certainly can think of, at least in this century, I'll say, Santanu. So and then also the equally garlanded India, Empire, and First World War Culture. He's also the editor of Race, Empire, and First World War Writing, and of the Cambridge Companion to the Poetry of the First World War. Santanu Das is currently editing the Oxford Book of Colonial Writings of the First World War, and he is writing a book on the experience and aesthetics of sea voyages, and I think this talk is going to tap into some of that research. So it's my great pleasure to give you the platform, Santanu. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Elika. You have really set me in now for a fall and disappointment. But many thanks to the Centre, for the Oxford Centre for Life Writing for this invitation, particularly to Hermione Lee, Elika Bama, and Ellery Watson. A couple of kind of trigger warnings, because my talk is full of, doings and things or members of members. So I think I should alert you at the very beginning. Maybe I'll stand here. I'm also actually at the beginning of this project, so it's not a kind of fully finished or polished piece. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A after this. So I'll speak for around, I think, 40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. A closet was often literally just a closet. Below the decks, between the guns in a warship, under boom covers and tarpaulins, with men and boys caught suddenly when a lantern was shone on their face or the moon emerged from the clouds. He hovers in the shadows. He figures here in a complaint by two boys in a letter to the Naval board. Or in a lieutenant's logbook with reference to a medical examination. Or sometimes overheard in the act of pillow talk in a hammock. You don't do it as well as I do it to you. This is two boys, George Hines and Thomas Hubert. One of them actually got hanged. This is aboard HMS St. George. Or in an article on flogging and consequent suicide. Or as an image with the dubious distinction of being the photograph of the first black man sentenced for the crime on a ship. Call him by any name: William Slade, James Ball, John Pyle, Robert Garbett, George Hines, Thomas Hubert. They were all men who had sex with other men. Some were rapists, some lovers, some gay men, some bisexuals, but the majority would be what perhaps could be called queer heterosexuals. Some were acquitted through lack of evidence, many flogged, a few hanged. If caught, it didn't matter whether the act was consensual or abusive, seduction or rape, both banned by the 29th Article of War of 1749 and punishable till 1820s with death, and filed away under the category of unnatural and detestable sin of sodomy. These are the files under sodomy in the National Archives. Let me take you to a court case that unfolded at the Gibraltar on 13th May 1863 to see what was at stake. Question: declare to the court what you know concerning this affair now trying before them. Answer: on Saturday last, the 8th instant, I went up on deck at 8 o'clock and saw the prisoners Martin Billing and James Bryan in the detestable act of sodomy and was struck with horror. I then seized them and called for a light, which was not coming immediately. I second time called, for God's sake, bring a light, for two men are buggering one another. Bryan then was uppermost and had his leg over Billing, endeavored to get on his breeches, but Billing lay still when the light came. And then I'll let you read. And this is the more interesting bit. I wonder if I'll read it out. Did you see Bryan's yard in Billing's body? Answer: no. By what means are you sure Bryan's yard having penetrated the body of Billing? Because I laid hold of part of his yard. The other part came out with a spring, as if a cork had been drawn out of a bottle. This exuberant testimony was not just an exercise in narrative jouissance or an example of homosexual panic. Every detail was vital to the processes of investigation and the resulting conviction. The two men were subjected to 200 lashes each, having escaped capital punishment on the grounds of being, I quote, interrupted before the criminal act was fully performed. But at the end of the file, there is a little note. The legality of the sentence may, however, be questioned. There is always a big question mark about these very distressing and unpleasant kind of court-martial cases. On one hand, there's this sort of panic. On the other hand, the shipmates all felt despondent when someone was hanged or even subjected to the lashes. So there is a complex emotional trade-off. How do we write queer lives at sea? At a time before sexology, when on land and in learned books, sodomy could only be referred to as the detestable and abominable sin among Christians not to be named. These witness testimonies are marked by their candor, robustness, and brio. The description, like the investigation, was however limited to the act without any inquiry into Wilde's kind of famous and sodomite. Do we limit ourselves to such records, or can the literary help us to understand the past and write a life? Were queer knowledge and practices at sea radically different from those on land? And if so, what kind of pressure do they put on our land-bound conceptualizations of sexuality and, more recently, of queer theory itself? What concerns me today is the naval community in the long 19th century, when we see the transition, if we are to believe Foucault, from the act to identity. In Epistemology of the Closet, the foundational work of queer theory for many, Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick boldly makes us move beyond the hetero-homo binary to what she calls the universalizing view, that homosexuality was not just the concern of a minority of people identified as homosexuals, but absolutely essential to a range of sexualities, to the very formation of gender categories. Maritime communities were perhaps the most ancient and the strongest of these homosocial communities, thrust between the devil and the deep blue sea, to borrow the title of the historian Marcus Rediker's seminal book. They had no one but just themselves. An 18th century frigate would often pack in as many as 600 bodies. As in the trenches of the First World War or in underground mines, tactile codes of ordinary society broke down. Men worked together as a collective laboring body, scrubbing decks, handling cells, repairing leaks, as they addressed each other as brother tar. In this Foucauldian heterotopia, I would have liked to play you a little clip from Britain's kind of staging of kind of Billy Budd, but I couldn't get it to work properly. So it's the scene where it says kind of, oh heave, and you see all this kind of backs of all these men kind of scrubbing the deck. And you suddenly realize the density of bodies kind of on board these ships. These men looked after each other when ill, joined hands as they sang and danced, and at night their hammocks often touched together. Ill-fed, ill-housed, ill-clothed, the sailor body was often an instrument of pain rather than that of desire. For example, we have this idea of the sailor as this kind of quintessential gay icon. For example, E.M. Forster having his first sexual encounter with a sailor in Alexandria, to our kind of Prince Andrew kind of being caught cavorting with a sailor by kind of Ferguson. So there is that mythology. On the other hand, if you look at records, at archival records, often he was just kind of too tired, too hungry to kind of be a kind of either an instrument or the object of desire. Seamen were tarred and feathered and often flogged. If naval historians, unlike the mariners, have often been too squeamish to acknowledge same-sex desire on board, in recent years, scholars such as B.R. Berg and William Benneman have read court-martials, powerfully arguing that sexuality was an invaluable tool to police behavior. What I propose here today is a more expansive definition for any history of sexuality, has to be nuanced to a far more intimate history of the body and emotions, loneliness, vulnerability, weariness, hunger, as well as, obviously, levels of testosterone. For after all, these are often young men. Consider the following two accounts, and the first one is, sorry, this is what I actually wanted to play from the Britain Opera. Yes. So this is from a diary, kind of 19th century diary. I'll come to it in a moment. And this is a conversation that has been recorded in the diary. Conversation last night with an old sailor on the subject of manual pollution. Well, White, what's your opinion of those men who have to do with boys? If you were king, wouldn't you kill every one of them? Yes, every fellow that lives ashore and does it, I would shoot them. Yes, I would shoot him. And if you had a navy, wouldn't you kill every man in it found guilty of that? No. What can a fellow do? 3 years at sea and hardly any chance to have a woman. I tell you, drummer, a fellow must do it. Biles and pimples and corruption will come out all over his body if you don't. The second one is by the naval officer and kind of writer, kind of Pierre Loti, kind of who sailed a lot, who was gay. I think it's, yes, from 1883. The warm darkness brought together thoughts of love, which were not of the sailor's seeking. There were moments when they came near to weakening again in a troubling dream. They felt the need of opening their arms to some desired human form, of clasping it with a strong and forceful, infinite tenderness. But no one, nothing. It was a necessity to pull themselves together, to remain alone, to turn over on the hard planks. The two passages almost exemplify the different impulses often associated with the testimonial and the fictional, vital record versus sensuous evocation. The robust defense of same-sex practices as a pragmatic choice, even a necessary outlet, immediately broadens the scope beyond a handful of homosexuals. In the second passage, we enter the phenomenology of desire, as it were. In A Lover's Discourse, Roland Barthes writes that, I quote, "The discourse of absence is a text with two ideograms. There are the raised arms of desire, and there are the wide-opened arms of need. Maritime eroticism worked on this thinned partition between need and desire. If secrecy was the structuring principle of the closet, according to Sedgwick, what marks the maritime closet was different in the sense that it was secrecy of act rather than the secrecy of desire. Reformist literature, as always, was on the case before others. In Sermons to Mariners, 1812, the Reverend Abbot singled out the young seamen for special advice. I quote, "Too many of you," he continued, "are willing to become seducers of the rest." So it's not just, what I'm trying to say is not just a particular handful of people, but it applied to the entire maritime community. This kind of strange paranoia on one hand, by others as well as from people on the ship. Similarly, a letter addressed to a young friend about to embark as a sailor on his first voyage, 1840, we are warned, I quote, "Avoid intimacies with the profane, the licentious, and the irreligious." And I think it kind of refers to largely female sex workers, but I think beneath it, maybe there's also a certain anxiety about having sex with other men. Gustavus Horner, in Diseases and Injuries of Seamen, 1854, notes that for sailors, I quote, "The seaman collects in large quantities." Sorry, this will be quite a couple of times. I'll go between the two. "Resulting in painful nocturnal emissions and violent spasms." He continues, "As a consequence of such sufferings, they resort to unnatural practices." Among his patients, Dr. Horner noted down a range of bodily signs, particularly venereal disease and nautical tattoos. In the 19th century, mariners were one of the largest groups of people with tattoos. and the nature and positions of such tattoos excited wild discussion across disciplines. For the French criminologist Charles Perrier, I quote, "A tattoo on the penis is definitely a sign of homosexuality." While for his fellow national Alexander Lassagne, I quote, he describes this kind of 12 tattoos collected from homosexuals, and I quote, "On the buttocks, lewd subjects, winged penises, penises with sails, a serpent pointing towards the anus." In recent years, there's another important source that come to light, some 3,500 pages of recruitment records, and this is in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and thankfully, I was there last year because I understand that increasingly, in order to access these records, you need to apply for permission from the American government, and often they are getting restricted. So I was very, very grateful I did this last year. So, and there is, I think they are in some ways on the right track. There are certain kind of striking tattoos. I'll show you how these records are. I don't know whether you can see at the final column, it says permanent marks. And I've got a little, so I took a little photograph, so I think you can read some of that. So a sailor had on his buttocks 2 inscriptions, "Open all night" and "Pay as you enter." Charles Moore, a 23-year-old former bricklayer who had joined the US Navy in 1864 from Indiana, had the words "ticket office" tattooed on his lower back, with an arrow just above anus. While another had a tattooed arrow on his back, pointing towards the anus with an inscription, "For men only." So, when Foucault says that the sodomite only thought of himself as the subject of kind of jurisdiction, we have a very different kind of kind of archive and identity or kind of erotic subjectivity coming out of these documents. Also, I think kind of these permanent marks, they have their share of penile tattoos, including the one, and this is here, I think, it's quite delicate, a butterfly on the penis. In his novel White Jacket, or The World in a Man of War, 1850, Herman Melville writes about the art of pricking. And if you remember, he italizes it. A bare arm or leg would be extended. The disagreeable business of pricking, italicized, would commence right under my eyes. Melville's italicization, double entendre, and repetition leave little room for speculation. But life is often stranger than fiction. The Roman Catholic sailors on board, Melville tells us, had at least the crucifix pricked on their arm. Some people took their faith too far, like a young man, Herman Meville. This is him actually. The initial columns of the enlistment rendezvous record suggest nothing exceptional. A 16-year-old lad, reported as rather nondescript, 4 feet 8.5 inches tall, grey eyes, dark complexion, unless he displays his glory, crucifix on the glans. In a context when most of these men were non-literate and did not leave or could not leave any testimonies, these kind of things provide a queer archive from below, when most 19th century models of same-sex desire, from Hellenism to Uranian love, come from relatively elite textual sources. They also suggest a kind of sustained attention to and delicate handling of private body parts of men by other men, perhaps adding a particular frisson to Sedgwick's definition of the homosocial. I'm not saying at all that all of them are gay or homosexual, but there is this very kind of sustained and quite kind of intense bodily contact. The most direct and most extensive records we have of the same-sex activities, of course, are from these naval ships of the 18th and 19th century, these voluminous proceedings of court-martial cases categorized under sodomy. And we have that both in the National Archives here as well as in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And kind of today I won't have much time, but actually I'm writing a long chapter on Billy Budd. And I was looking at the records, both kind of just after the Napoleonic War, when the novel is set, as well as kind of late 19th century, when Melville is actually kind of writing the novel. I'll come to that later. These accounts vary in length and detail, as does the nature of the deed. The proceedings range from cases of straightforward rape to two men, I quote, playing and toying with one another on deck as man would with a girl, to the Baroque processes of detection with which we began. Some read like little novellas. And so this is a case from April 1855 aboard the ship Potomac. It's a naval ship, with one John Cummings, who brought a charge of sodomy against an officer, very unusual, Lieutenant Owen Burns, with his underage kind of servant boy, Arthur Hanson. Cummings had gone to Hanson's hammock to get his jacket. And then he says, I put my hand into the hammock, feeling for my jacket, and I touched his penis, which was wet. I think it's here. And it's a very unusual case because usually it's the boys that bring along the charge, not someone else. And then the case gets more complicated because suddenly there's a parallel investigation that starts, and we realize that the person who had brought along the charge was actually the lover of this young servant boy, and it's a case of jealousy and vengeance. And in kind of ship kind of language, this older man who had brought along the charge, the young boy was his chicken. And that was, and I found that in several records, in both court-martial cases as well as in a diary I'll talk about later. It was a kind of an established language. And what is very interesting is that this kind of same-sex model, it's not kind of predicated on kind of man and wife, on kind of effeminacy that we associate kind of post-Wild, but it's kind of based on, as a kind of chicken, its age and seniority and protection. And it also kind of reminds me of the queer kind of theorist, kind of Jack Halberstam's kind of idea that, we apply, and I'll come to this a bit later, we often apply what we do not know to what we cannot know. And whether certain hardened sexual identities that we have often today kind of leave out certain things that were happening there and still happen today. Like, for example, this kind of arrangement is very common, for example, now in Afghanistan, the Chai boys. Of course it's abusive, it's exploitative, but it is very much there. And these men often would not identify themselves as kind of gay or homosexuals. Now we can argue whether it's kind of repression or whether it's something else, but these things do happen even now. For example, there's this huge whole category of kind of men having sex with men, which kind of AIDS activists use when they work on, for example, South Asia or the Middle East. And it's very similar what I'm seeing in this kind of 18th and 19th century kind of ships, this whole category of kind of men having sex with other men. Now, this shipboard sodomy trials also illuminate the density of social and sexual relations. Given the various twists, false accusations, contradictory evidence by witnesses, and allegations of miscarriage of justice, these trials show how shipboard community was acutely aware of the unstable relationship between law, justice, and knowledge, which will be quite central to Billy Budd. What we do not have is much indication of the subjectivity of the people concerned. And I'll conclude this section with two kind of passages which are both exceptions. The first is the distressing case of George Newton and Tom Finley, who were loving partners, but Finley was underage and he was kind of sentenced to be hanged. And his poor kind of boyfriend, absolutely desperate to save his partner, keeps insisting that the sex was consensual. And then he says that, look, he's not the first person. I had sex with all these other people. And even on land, I visited these places. And suddenly, you have this whole life, which we don't have in these records. Like, you have a record of his life for kind of 10 or 15 years. And we have the emergence often of this kind of life stories among these very fragmented archival records. The other example, and I think he's my kind of hero, This is the boatswain, kind of William Brown, and it's on a ship. It's a famous ship, HMS African, and scholars have written on it, like Arthur Gilbert. It was remarkable because in this ship, no less than 23 members of the crew were implicated in acts of sodomy. And there was this kind of very elaborate trial, and this is the boatswain speaking. He said that God must have put it into men's heart to commit the unnatural crime of buggery. And therefore, if God was to put it into his head to fuck a man, he would as soon do it as fuck a woman, and which were by him several times repeated, accompanied by horrid expressions. The irrepressible Brown continued, saying that, I quote, he would bugger not only the captain and the officers, but Jesus Christ if he was in his coffin, for God had put it into his head. Now, this is one of the earliest defenses of homosexual inclination that have come across several decades before the German sexologists. Brown hints at a certain erotic subjectivity far in excess of, in Foucauldian terminology, homosexuals viewing themselves as nothing more, as I said, than the juridical subject of forbidden acts. If court-martial reports have dominated recent historical analysis of same-sex practices aboard ships, the diaries of drummer Philip C. Van Buskirk provides a remarkable counter-archive. But Van Buskirk entered the United States Marine Corps as a drummer in 1848 and traveled extensively in various naval ships until he left the Marine Corps in 1869. And two historians have worked on Buskirk. They are still unpublished, but we have some extracts from these extraordinary diaries. From 1851, he kept a diary for nearly every single day till 1902. On May 25th, 1853, that is 2 years before having begun his diary, Van Buskirk writes, "My most secret thoughts I commit to these pages. Of these, 6 volumes covering his time with the Marine Corps from 1851 to 1869 provide possibly the most intimate and the most intrepid account of erotic life at sea. There is no school of vice comparable to the Navy," Van Buskirk warns us, adding, "Certainly 90% of the white boys in the Navy of this day are blasphemous and sodomites." For Buskirk, sex among lads in the ship is more the norm than the exception. We meet a host of characters who seem to have stepped straight out of a Dickens world gone queer. There is the arch-reprobate Colburn, whom Van Buskirk tries to reform, the drummer nicknamed Little Cigar Boy, who sells his body along with the cigars, the crew member Billy Doo, who pays boy prostitutes with the coffee that he has brewed. Men often gift boys hammocks in order to have sex with them. One day, Van Buskirk is surprised when the laughing philosopher and budding phrenologist Peabody shocks him, this is in the night, by fiddling with his fly. The hive of activity is the boom cover where these boys meet for gossip and mutual pollution. Again, trigger warning, this is quite explicit, sorry, can't. Yes, that's it. I'll just read out the second paragraph. "Sin, sin, I had at midnight perpetrated onanism. When I turned out at 4 o'clock, it happened that I encountered the boy daily, a most hardened and inveterate sodomite, under the boom cover. The boy insisted upon performing onanism for me. I objected to the crime, but I was powerless to check the evil. The boy had me completely in his power. My struggle to free myself from his grasp only hastened the consummation of the evil. Thus bedeviled, I did not hesitate in the least to do for Daly what he had done for me." Masturbation, referred to as cho-cho, shakings, yankum, was the commonest form of shipboard eroticism, as Van Buskirk writes about sailors, I quote, "frigging, privately and communally, with and for each other. On the other hand, when he lectures a young Joe on whom he has a crush on the dangers of masturbation, Joe replies bluntly, "I like women too well to do that to myself. I acknowledge doing it for other men, but I haven't done it to myself since I've been in the ship, except once." It's very interesting that it's masturbation, not same-sex practices, that is set against homosexuality. And it's a very different kind of formation that we often see. At a time when the intellectual world was swirling with discourses on sexology, Van Buskirk's diary provides a working-class archive, robust, less angst-ridden, and not consciously organized under the star of queerness, which he records with a combination of erotic shiver and reformist horror. Yet, reading today, it is undoubtedly the most powerful example of queer life writing at sea. Speaking of life writing, Hermione Lee has noted, I quote, and this is on the video that's on the homepage of the Oxford Life Writing Centre. And I actually kind of visit that quite often because it's like the central truths of life writing are just set there in that video. Kind of Eleka is there, Kate is there. It's really, really useful. It has to do with emotion, with memory, and a sense of identity. Memory in this diary is perhaps both the instrument and the wound. For alongside these accounts of cruising, there is also a painfully honest account of the various rejections and disappointments and heartbreak and loneliness which gave a certain emotional depth to the diary and a certain sense of time. Again, it's a life. We get the arc of a life. There is also a certain erotic subjectivity, whether it be desire, experience, or habit, which is not yet aligned to a sense of identity, which is that of an American, a Marine, a drummer. Van Buskirk, and maybe an onanist, is much more concerned about masturbation than about the same-sex practices. He's absolutely terrified about what he is doing to himself. Van Buskirk bears testimony to a range of same-sex proclivities, intimacies, and practices which had not yet solidified into a stable notion of identity. It testifies not to some polymorphous perversity, but rather the loose ends and crossed ends, more perverse and more fecund than the places where identity, desire, analysis, and need can always be aligned and centered, and that is so common in academic discourses on queer theory. There is often the attempt to find this insurgent, radical, kind of liberatory kind of past, but it's often much more darker, much more tortured. I'm reminded of the phrase perverse presentism, and I think I mentioned kind of Jack Halberstam before, the idea of what we do not know in the present to what we cannot know in the past. Now, after all this, to come to Melville's Billy Budd, sailor, and in some ways it's already predetermined by the way I've set it up, but I'll slightly kind of go against the grain. So after the sodomy trials and Van Buskirk's diary is to recognize the worlds that throng under that resonant phrase, but for fate and man. One of the blind spots of the substantial and often powerful critical literature surrounding Billy Budd is the erasure of the naval context. Whereas, if you read carefully and if you particularly kind of see the opera, you will see how enmeshed we are in the whole kind of context of the Napoleonic Wars and the Navy. Both Van Buskirk and Melville would have been sailing in the mid-19th century. Melville's novella was dedicated to Jack Chase, the handsome captain of the USS Frigate Never Sink, on which he served for 14 months from 1843 kind of summer to autumn 1844. In White Jacket, a novel based on this experience, Melville refers to the ships as, I quote, "this wooden-walled Gomorrahs of the deep," adding, "more than once complaints were made at the mast in the Never Sink, from which the desk officer would turn away with loathing, refuse to hear them, and command the complainant out of sight." Billy Budd resists that knowledge. It is aware, but I think it's consciously kind of resisting it. Billy Budd is a strange shadow play of some of the elements of court-martial trial, possibly based on the Somers kind of drumhead court, whispers and bodily contact at night, fears of a mutiny, miscarriage of justice, flogging and hanging, with the story of desire that marks Van Buskirk's narrative. But what we have here is something very different, and this is where the strangeness of fiction lies, particularly the strangeness of a novella like Billy Budd. And instead of, kind of sodomy being the subject, we have military insubordination. And there is a definite relationship between military transgression and sexual transgression, something that was not lost on Forster and Britain, because Britain puts in the military tune every time the erotic kind of heat kind of goes out of hand. In a letter to Benjamin Britten about Billy Budd in 1950, Forster wrote, I quote, "I want passion, love constricted, perverted, poisoned, but nevertheless flowing down its agonizing channel, a sexual discharge gone evil." But this is no simple tale of sexual passion. In a seminal article, Melville's Fist, Barbara Johnson, I think in one of those early deconstructive moves, argued how, I quote, "The plot works against the characters in the novella. Billy is good, but he ends up killing Claggart. Claggart is evil, but he dies a victim. Captain Vere is wise, but he allows Billy, whom he believes to be innocent, to be hanged." We are thrown into some of the most strenuous questions about the relation between law and justice, action and intent, good and evil. As if this is not enough, Melville throws masses of maritime information at us. This is one of the most overwritten of novellas. Naval impressment, Napoleonic War, fears of mutiny, references to Nelson, Noor, colonialism. And I think there are almost these two modes, and I call them, one is this debris of information, and there are moments of conflagration in the novel. And I think the debris is absolutely essential to this kind of moments when the entire thing kind of starts burning. And yet, coursing through all these masses of information is the current of desire, which all holds it together. Critics from F.O. Mattison through W.H. Auden to Sedgwick have focused on Claggart, the repressed homosexual. But the queer imagination at work in this novella is far deeper and wider. And I'm reminded, and this is not at all a very strict analogy, but I'm just reminded of a scene of, I guess, many of you would have seen the film, kind of Jean Genet's kind of Les Chats d'Amour, where the prisoners, they try to communicate across this cement wall. And there's a tiny little crack, and one of them kind of blows kind of cigarette smoke. And it's one of the kind of extremely tender and erotic scene that these two men are trying to communicate. There is this kind of cement wall, and there's a crack, and they kind of one blows kind of cigarette smoke through that crack, and the other one gets the smoke and inhales it. And for me, it's often like that, there is this kind of thick wall of fate and ban, of all this information. And then Melville says, but I'll give you kind of desire through it, and suffuse kind of both the rooms with that. Let me begin with the most enigmatic sentence. And I think this smoke for Melville is more than character or plot, his style, the tortured kind of brocaded prose. And I'll start with the most enigmatic sentence, at least for me. Yet, and sometimes the melancholy expression would have in it a touch of soft yearning, as if Claggart could even have loved Billy, but for fate and ban. Is this the syntax of repression or of denial, the subjunctive mood unfolding to the accretion of clauses and the hesitancy of commas? Is Claggart's villainy a function of his depravity, or is it the inadmissibility of desire that turns his love to malice? Indeed, does that word soft, that favorite word of Keats and Lawrence, and I think both have this quite interesting relationship with Melville, suggest a passing wistfulness of mood or palpability of flesh or the proximity of its object? Melville was a novelist with a poet's sense of the word. The febrile quality of this novella is largely, I think, because of the restless, objectless palpability of verbs. of images and metaphors shimmering in excess of their context. Melville was 70 when he started working on Billy Budd. In the headstone to John Marr and Other Sailors, 1880, which originally included the poem Billy in the Darbies, the aging Marr muses on his shipmates of long ago as phantoms of the dead. He remembers their faces. The veteran Melville scholar, Herschel Parker, has noted, as he aged, Melville's mind became thronged with the faces of seamen he had known for 4 decades. Few novellas are as obsessed with faces, facial expressions, as this. From the opening ekphrastic lingering on the face of the black sailor, lustrous with perspiration, to Claggart's, I quote, eyes strangely suffused with incipient feverish tears when he looks at Billy, or Dangster's grim internal merriment when his weasel eyes alight on Billy, to the infatuated close-ups on the handsome sailor himself, I quote, lingering adolescent expression in the as yet smooth face, the ear, the small and shapely curve in the mouth and nostril, or the bonfire in the heart made luminous the rose tan of his cheek. What Merleau-Ponty calls the palpation of the eye becomes the mode of contact, not just between characters, but between the reader and the author here. Contact between bodies happens so rarely that we take note. Eros parades first as mischief, then I would say as metaphor, and finally as mutiny. Claggart famously chances upon the starboard at the precise moment when Billy spills his soup, which I quote, streams across the deck. This is a very well-known scene. I quote, pausing, he was about to ejaculate something hasty at the sailor, but checked himself and playfully tapped him behind with the rattan, saying, handsomely done, my lad. And handsome is as handsome did it too. If Claggart is being ironic, so is the text. A page earlier, upon hearing that Claggart is down on him, I quote, Jamie Legs ejaculated Billy, his Welkin eyes expanding, and you know where I'm going. Van Buskirk's going chaw-chaw or manual pollution seems to happen between Billy and Claggart at first touch, as language touches itself through repetition and ejaculates. The Oxford English Dictionary records its use in the sexual sense in 1888. Such sexual innuendos would not have been lost on Melville, as we have seen with his doubleton on prick. In this novella, when Billy dies, 2 sailors discuss, I quote, the absence of spasmodic movement. Later, he is described in the closing song as the pendant pearl on the yard arm. In Redburn, when recounting his first view of the port of Liverpool, Melville writes of, I quote, the yard arm touching yard arm in brotherly love. If Melville puts in such sexual innuendos, this lover of opera also provides us with some of his finest operatic moments, as he moves towards a much queerer imagination. And this is not just innuendo or jokes, but the intensity of relationship between men at certain extreme moments. And I'm running out of time, so I won't read it. This is the famous encounter between the 3, Claggart, Billy, and Captain Vere. And I'll just read out, so Claggart brings in this kind of false charge, and then Vere says that, defend yourself. Contrary to the effect intended, these words, so fatherly in tone, doubtless touching Billy's heart to the quick, prompted yet more violent efforts to utterance. The next instant, quick as the flame from a discharged cannon at night, his right arm shot out, and Claggart dropped to the deck. Forster called it a moment of satanic intimacy. The face is exposed, vulnerable, as if inviting an act of violence, notes Levinas. At the same time, he continues, the face is what prohibits us from killing. But what if the face dissembles? Metaphors get literalized as the twice-repeated stroke gets translated to action. At the precise point when Captain Vere lays a soothing hand on Billy, asking him to speak, as Melville reminds us of Vere's hand in this tragedy. It is as if this gesture of tenderness, touching Billy's heart to the quick, elicits a response, but given Billy's speech impediment, it can only speak in terms of bodily violence. The syntax here tries to absolve Billy of agency and therefore of culpability, but the imagery completely aligns him with the violence of military action. And I say that because I think some critics have argued that Billy is a very gentle person, but if you read carefully, he really kind of strikes, and before that he has done it again. Warring impulses are combined, playing out in miniature the interpretive and moral conundrum that the novel has posed. So too is the relationship between chance, aggression, and eros. The hand which is not allowed to touch can only strike. Throughout the narrative, words like twitchings, spasm, and convulsion had spoken with a double tongue. Now discharge explicitly figures violence as eros, as innuendos, an innuendo not lost upon Forster, who, as I already said, summed up the whole story as a sexual discharge gone evil. If discharge, following one line of interpretation, figures the assault as penetration, the erotic pulse keeps moving as erect is transferred from Claggart's fall from erectness to the captain's regaining erectness. The men are connected in other ways too. The word fate, used with reference to Claggart, as in fate and ban, returns in the captain's exclamation, fated boy, to describe Billy, who has now violated the ban against assaulting a superior officer. And this is the thickness of words. They look in so many different directions. Melville's own judgment on this is not straightforward. His sympathies are with Billy, falsely accused and with a disability, but his employment of militaristic imagery, flame, cannon, shot, is startling. Bellipotent is a man of war. Melville was acutely alert to the fact these loving communities of men were also killing machines. The question is, however, as Sedgwick asked, is men's desire for other men the great preservative of these masculine cultures, or is it one of its most potent threats? Both literary and legal scholars have long agonized over why would this otherwise wise Captain Vere summon the drumhead court and then actively interfere with the court proceedings. While revising the text, Melville became obsessed with this figure of the captain, changing him till his death with every draft, so that, in the language of genetic criticism, he is more a composite character rather than an evolved one. Why did he so capriciously not only summon the drumhead court, but harangue the jury, as Forster noted, and succeeded in condemning the innocent Billy? Vere epitomizes three things that, for Melville, made the naval institution contravene the basic tenets of the American Constitution: irresponsibility in a judge, unlimited discretionary authority in a judge, and the union of this judge and the executive in one person. And all three are Vere, this huge concentration of authority, which is politically reprehensible. But what it does create, Melville seems to suggest, are structures of feeling as powerful as they are perverse. For both the captain and the Billy die with each other's names on their lips. But before that, Melville inserts a scene that breaks all rules of fiction: the imagined embrace between Captain Vere and Billy during that closeted interview. And this is my last slide, and I won't read all of it, just read a few sentences. Beyond the communication of the sentence, what took place at the interview was never known. It would have been in consonance with the spirit of Captain Vere should he on this occasion have concealed nothing from the condemned one. On Billy's side, it is not improbable that such a confession would have been received in much the same spirit that prompted it. Not without a sort of joy, indeed, he might have appreciated the brave opinion of him implied in his captain's making such a confidant of him. What is implied in the above scene is that Vere personally communicates to Billy that he had actively interfered and sentenced him to death. And Billy, instead of protesting, is filled with joy. Joy at the realization that the captain had made a confidant of someone as lowly as him. He is, after all, an orphan, and captain was the only father he had known. The death sentence and its communication become a perilous bond. Much more perverse, I would argue, than the depravity, so-called depravity of Claggart, or the interference of Captain Vere in the trial, is this abjectly joyous self-sacrifice on part of Billy. So extreme is the vulnerability of the foundling turned foretopman and its consequent adoration of the captain that the sentence of death appears as the supreme gift of intimacy. Melville equates abjection with tragic form itself, the libidinous joy of self-sacrifice for the object of adoration. Closet drama flowers into tragedy without a break or mediating pause. Behind it moves the whole imperial homosocial world of Victorian military and naval institutions and the interlocked notions of duty, sacrifice, and bonding. The classic example, of course, is the famous poem, "The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck," and shouted, but once more aloud, "My father, must I stay?" While over him fast, to sail and shroud, the wreathing fires made way. The poem, like Billy Budd, is set in the time of Napoleonic Wars. And then you have Captain Vere saying that he might have gathered Billy to his heart. And again, it's kind of phrased as something that we do not know, might have. And I think Herschel Parker says that it achieves nothing. But if you actually watch the play, I think it achieves an enormous amount because this single touch of Captain completely changes, in a way, the mood and the relationship at the end, that at least kind of Billy has that kind of acknowledgement. And certainly, from the perspective of Captain Vere, I think paternity, vulnerability, regret, and the sense of intimacy, they're all fused. So what Melville is doing towards the very end is a much more expansive exploration of this kind of intense male bond, which can be called queer, but goes far beyond any small or any narrow definition of sexuality. For example, I watched a production by Deborah Warner, and there was absolutely kind of no touch at the end, and it was so very bleak. Just if there's just one touch, it kind of changes the mood. In fiction, for the purposes of history, the novelist and critic Richard Slotkin notes, I quote, before the novel imaginatively recovers the indeterminacy of a past time, the form allows writer and reader to explore alternative possibilities of belief, action, and political change, unrealized by history that existed in the past. What we see here is something far more strange. Melville comes in sideways and on tiptoe, setting up his mirror at odd angles. It's a queer imagination in its plumbing of this male drama of intimacy, which goes far beyond just the sexual or practices, though inflected perhaps by them. The shipboard is the stage, throbbing with the erotic pulse, but the whole world, law, justice, theology, war, is their subject. We are not presented with immediate or easily visible alternative possibilities of belief, or indeed of political change. I think there is this tremendous, as I said, imperative on part of particularly queer theorists, but also I think it's very present is that, go to the past, ransack it, to say something is radical, something is there for political change. It's often much more kind of regressive and knotted and perverse. And I think this is what we need to take into account. Instead, a novella like Billy Budd makes us think, bring to surface certain structures of feeling, as perverse as they are powerful, to which we have a certain responsibility of what Heather Love calls emotional rescue in all their tortured nature. More importantly, it allows us, more than the archive of the legal documents that I showed, or even the diary, it allows us to imagine a life or lives at sea, as it did for Forster and Benjamin Britten, but that's another story. Thank you.
Can you hear me still? Now? Yes. Okay. Now? No, it was the other one, wasn't it?
No.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the one, isn't it? Yeah, there we go. Santanu, thank you for a powerful and evocative, provocative and very affecting talk, actually. And I have a few, they're more like explorations than they are questions. It's kind of responding to some of the provocations of the talk. And then we'll open up, because I'm sure people want to pitch in. It's kind of starting. It was a game of two halves, wasn't it? That you were talking about your archival investigations into this kind of queer archive of the 19th century at sea, and then you were homing in on Belly Bud and the kind of the insights that the fiction gives. And I was reminded, as in the first part. Of the First World War work, and where you were looking at erotic archives there, but you were also looking at subjects who did not have literacy. You were looking at song, you were looking at residue, you were looking at marks, you were looking at stains, and that's kind of been carried over here. A kind of reading between the lines, and a kind of almost kind of forensic poring over the ship's records and the logbooks that you showed us. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit. This was for me the very affecting part, and when you brought the young men's names out of the archive, Charles Moore and Tom this and Billy that, I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how it has been to extend that. I mean, you are a scholar, but again, you're looking at this profoundly non-verbal, very physical, in some cases quite funny, but also kind of disturbing, very intimate archive.
Yes, and very visceral.
Yeah, very visceral. Yeah.
Account. Yes, I'd always been interested, this kind of male communities. And with my, first book, it was kind of more literate, but also the illiterate. And I think that it actually kind of partly goes back to my unhappiness, maybe, with something that became quite important in post-colonial criticism. The subaltern cannot speak.
Yeah.
And often it's not that the subaltern cannot speak, we cannot hear the subaltern if we don't work hard enough. So for me, I think that, archival work is very, very important. And two things I realized when working on the Indian soldiers and also here, that you have to create your own archive. Because that is one important thing. So I go here to tattoos, which I've never done that. And I got completely, immersed. I went to America to look at what we have there. Tattoos, there are other things. This is just one part of the book. I talk about kind of tramp steamers. I talk about various other things, and there are other kinds of documents. But one is creating your own archive. For me, I think that's very important because it's a reality check. And sometimes I think, like yesterday, I was talking with a colleague, and we were thinking of having a little conference saying, de-waffling literary criticism. And I think for me, archive is very, very important because, as I said, it keeps us grounded. But secondly, it's not just finding an archive. I think an imperial historian and a queer or post-colonial literary critic can look at the same archive and ask very different questions. So what questions we ask of that archive. So some of this, the sodomy trials, I think there's one scholar, kind of Berg, he is very, very good historian. He has looked at it, but it's through imperial control. And I ask a completely different set of questions. It's like, when I looked at the sound recordings from the Berlin Prisoner of War archives, and I saw Yasmin here, I think she also knows this. So they were looking at it as ethnography. I look at it as life writing. So I think the two things, like create your own archive, and I think, there is no map for that. You have to follow your nose. And secondly, it's what questions you use ask of that archive.
And I mean, it's also another resonance I had was Amitav Ghosh thinking about the Lascars.
Songs.
And the songs, and also their language.
Yes.
That they evolved a particular kind of, idiolect that kind of moved around and between communities at sea. And it was a very specific vocabulary that was developed by the Lascars at sea, which has become lost. Ghosh has gone into ship's records and tried to retrieve some of those words. You've gone into these records and kind of retrieved records of tattoos that have now disappeared. They have the bodies that carry the tattoos have gone. So it too is a very
Yes, on language, actually, there's a very gay language, kind of Polari. I didn't have time, but it's a very different lingo when they talk. When this kind of gay sailors talk to each other. And it's there. It can be recovered. Just as Amitav Ghosh, you said that he creates. And also, I have an actually long kind of chapter when I talk about the colonial kind of Lascars, kind of men of color. And it's their songs, but also certain very their imaginative description of ships. So for the hull, they call it fauna, which is like a snake's hood. So it's a very different kind of imagination that they bring to describing things. You have a bit of that, for example, in the very first chapter of Mulkraj Anand's Across the Black Waters, when he's coming to Europe for the first time, and he thinks, you have kind of written on it, the ocean, the froth of the ocean, it's very, very angry, kind of, it's like the spit of the god or something, he says that, and then he has a dream. So I think, yes, you have to kind of look hard, and it's there. But I think it's all in different places,
yes.
And I think you have to kind of weave them together.
And out of that weaving create, as you were saying several times, this arc of a life.
Yes.
That in that moment of Charles Moore's story that kind of pops up, there's just an instance in an arc. And I suppose, and now I just want to pivot round to Melville and to what the literary brings, because you were very concerned. You bracketed the talk with saying, that literature gives a different way of marshalling these details, these evanescent details, into a life arc, something that is more coherent and that gives meaning to these lives that have been lost and relatively unrecorded. Billy Budd, to me, you've really helped in the second half of the talk, sort of understanding for me a bit more of this strange and slippery and mysterious work, and I just wanted. Right at the end, you mentioned it: the orphanhood of Billy, the beauty of Billy,
Sorry.
and also the potential of Billy, because that to me, I remember the first time I read Billy Budd. And when I got to the end of the novella, I couldn't believe this was the end. It was. I understand.
There's so many ends.
Yeah, exactly.
There's kind of three ends.
So it is. Billy is all potential, and he's so clever physically, and this chance cuts him down. Can you just talk a little bit more about the potential of Billy and what Melville is, that way in which Melville sets him up as a kind of an icon of male beauty, a sort of figure of Eros?
Yes.
Yeah.
He's a figure of Eros, but there is this kind of excess about that figuration, and I think that's very important. As if it's overwritten. There's an excessive quality to the prose. There is an excessive quality to the beauty of Billy, and I think that is very important. And that is where I said at one point, I think I said this kind of restless, kind of objectless verbs, as if they're looking for something they don't really know. Melville just puts them together, and I think it's not closeted in the sense Forster's novel or Wilde's kind of plays are closeted. This is a man who's really tortured, who doesn't always kind of know what's going on, and out of that, comes Billy. Now, what is the potential of, you said, what is the potential of Billy? I think
I mean, when we start reading, speaking of life arc, we think this character
It helps us to imagine something. For example, I ended on that, and again, I didn't have time. Like Forster and Britain, they come to this whole kind of naval tradition through the figure of Billy Budd. And for me also, all these archives, they become even more perhaps interesting because of what we know of the life of Billy. And in the novella, I think what is very complex and difficult is that on one hand, there's this miscarriage of justice, and we get emotionally completely churned up. And somehow we kind of transfer that onto this kind of almost kind of parallel drama of kind of love or kind of longing and intimacy. Because I think there are three things happening. One is that there is the resident repressed homosexual claggart. That's a very local, something very particular. But then there's a much larger kind of drama of male intimacy, which is not sexual. There may be elements, but it, as I said, paternal, he's an orphan, vulnerable, there is class, speech defect, all of that is there. And then this excessive prose. And I think all three kind of feed into it rather than just the figure of Billy. Yeah. Because he doesn't really say much. Only at one point he says, I wish if I could have used my speech instead of my hand.
Yes.
Towards the end.
Yes. And this is my final one. It's not even a question, really. It's just a kind of comment. I did, throughout, while you were speaking of Billy Budd in the second half of the talk, I did, of course, think of Ishmael and Queequeg, so fraternally and happily sharing that bed at the start of Moby Dick, and how and this fraternal bond, kind of this agonized, fraught fraternal bond contrasts with the kind of the gay pleasures and in all senses of the word.
Do we know it's gay?
We don't know. I mean, gay as in. But let's open to questions, comments, further explorations if people have them here in the audience. We're right in the front, and then.
Yes, that was absolutely gripping. Thank you so much.
Gripping.
I was thinking about mutiny, and particularly because of what you said about how we mustn't allow ourselves necessarily to think of historical queer writing as proposing or recommending political change, but actually to be sort of devil's advocate on it. I'm thinking about that other story by Melville, Benito Cereno, where there has been a mutiny, and the slave shipmen, as it were, have taken over the ship, and so there's this terrifying, topsy-turvy scenario, which actually is tremendously frightening and sinister. And one of the things I think that Forster and Britain get very well out of Billy Budd is that sense that his potential might have been actually, had he not been a loyal and a God-fearing, loyal boy, as it were, to lead a mutiny. And there is a sense of a potential mutiny on board in the opera, which is fantastically powerful. So I wondered whether you would go anywhere in the direction of making a parallel between the real risk and fear of mutiny and the sense of a suppressed community of people who might, as it were, take over the hierarchy of society, i.e. the gay, a queer community, whether there's a parallel there or not in Melville's mind.
No, absolutely. It's a very interesting question, Herman. Thank you. No, when I said that, we should not go to the past just to get for a radical thing, I mean, I should have clarified, if there are radical impulses, and sometimes we should absolutely acknowledge that, rather than impose something. And with Melville, you're absolutely right, there are radical impulses. And I think Benito Cereno is positioned in relationship to the absent slavery archive, just as, Billy Budd is structured in relationship to the material in the first part of my talk. It's very much there. Now, if it's a very difficult question because is part of Claggart's homosexual, homophobic impulses shared by Melville? Because there is this central question around the word depravity that he uses. Now we never know, he doesn't make clear, is the depravity because of what he is or because he cannot express what he is? And I think that ambiguity lends kind of its own kind of charge to the novella. At the same time, it also kind of imagines, as you say, there are certain kind of queer, it's a very queer imagination because in the sense it's not just Billy, it's not just Claggart, it's like he's like the Teorema figure from Pasolini. Everyone is attracted to Billy. And that's where I think what you are saying, this kind of whole kind of radical potential of this kind of queer subaltern coming to the force comes in. And the question is that, does that hold the ship together? Or is there a fear that if they all start having sex with each other, it might splinter that community? And I think the whole novella treads a very difficult and thin line between the two. That is it holding it all together, this beauty. And it was the same in the First World War. I think Robert Graves says that if a very handsome young officer comes, everyone will adore him. Not just because of their homoerotic bits, but because they are themselves quite grimy and dirty. And it's this whole hunger for beauty in this world.
Isn't there also, just as a footnote to that, isn't there also kind of mutinous susurration on the ship? And isn't Billy, isn't there that that attempt to implicate Billy in
yes,
that?
Of course. Absolutely. At night, he hears, it's very interesting, at night someone touches him and there's a coin. And, this trope is often there in the sodomy trials, that someone gets touched at night. And suddenly when you read that, after reading the trials, you think, what is happening? Someone gets touched. But this is for a mutiny. And I think Britain was so acute that for him, the two are always together, this kind of sexual transgression and military transgression.
Lockie's hand over there, and I see a hand over there. Yes, Sally's hand. Yeah.
Where am I going?
So Lockie, to three rows back.
I'm going to ask you to pass this along.
Thanks, Santanu. It was a very brief moment in your talk, but I was struck by the moment of patterning when you were drawing out this figure of the erect and the erection, and it made me think in relation to Forster about this question of rhythm. And coming back earlier on to what you were talking at the start about what the stakes of this project might be more generally for queer theory and for theory with a capital T, it made me think that Billy Budd in some sense is a text that for a certain kind of formalist you want to make less of it. It's overwrought structure. And on the other hand, for a certain kind of theorist or queer theorist, it's want to be instrumentalized or to make it more than it is. In some ways, do you see this project, this relation between the literary and the queer archive as a way to kind of suture together a certain kind of formalism and capital T theory that has become detached or unmoored from each other in some strange way, that where both have become animus and we lose Billy Budd or the text more generally in between the two?
It's interesting. Thanks, Lockie. So I think there are different strands within queer theory. And so Heather Love, in an article, Emotional Rescue, she says that we have a certain responsibility to recover, this kind of complex emotional nuances rather than just instrumentalizing them. And often in these complex emotional nuances, there are certain bits, partly as Hermione was suggesting, that can be kind of picked up. So rather than saying all of it is, radical, we can say there are certain radical impulses. So I think something like that can be done. I think, first, okay, I'll give you a kind of a personal example. I was giving a paper on Billy Budd in Chicago. And I had a respondent with a very long response, almost as long as my paper. And then after the response, and it was an audience like this, everyone started laughing. We realized we have almost read different texts. He was very, very nice, this kind of critic. And he said that, Santanu, The thing is that you want to know what Melville was doing, what the text is saying. What I want to do is how can we read the text so as to prevent Trump from coming to power? And then I was speaking to some other American colleagues, and they said, actually, I can see also that point, this, this potential. So I think that, it's very different agendas. I have some problems with this second one. But as I said that, with queer theory, with a capital T, there is a pushback against some of the excesses. And I would say Jack Halberstam and Heather Love, both of them want a certain kind of honest kind of recovery of the past. Because if we try this insurgent thing, it's in terms of what we know, whereas there are other things which we may not know, which we lose if we try just to instrumentalize it. So I would say that there is future for queer theory with capital T, even with the kind of readings that I'm proposing. I don't know whether that answers.
We have a final question.
Final question, Sally.
Thanks very much. That was wonderful. I want to take us back to that the sailor who was saying, "Oh, kill them all if they're on land, but at sea, well, of course, because otherwise they come out in pimples." And that's so sort of linked to particularly the quack medicine of the time, but also quite a lot of the medical theory, and also all the discussions about public schools, because there's such parallels. And you were saying about the worries about masturbation being even worse than the mutual engagement.
Yes.
And again, I think it's very parallel. And but what you've got is sort of it all operating at a sort of, well, it's cross-class on ships, isn't it? It's not just the upper classes; it's the upper classes as officers and the ordinary sailors.
Absolutely, Sally. I was thinking of the public school novels, and in public schools, for example, the different kind of, what do you call them, instruments as to prevent young boys from masturbating. I remember taking a course with actually Alison Hennigan in Cambridge, which was all about the public school novels. And this need to find this kind of figure of the homosexual, often in public school novels, because they are so homosocial. So there are very clear parallels. The only difference, I would say, that maybe here, as this sailor says, since it's on sea, they're slightly relaxed, but that the phobic element, I would say, is absolutely kind of, it cuts across kind of both public school, like Tell England and all of that, and some of these novels. Only that I think the public school novels are coming slightly later, like 1870s. That's the ones I know. There may be ones earlier.
After Tom Brown's school days and
thereafter. Because I read quite a bit of that when I was doing my first World War book. But yes, I was thinking of them as well. Thank you.
I mean, I was thinking, which is a sidebar completely, and so I didn't mention it up to now, but now it's relevant that in Baden-Powell's manual, Scouting for Boys, the onanism that he's very worried about is kind of threads all the way through, and yet is never mentioned, and is excised by his editors. So.
Yes, I was also reminded of, this is the headmaster of rugby, and I think it's 1888. He says, "My boys are amorous, but seldom erotic." People are thinking about, but this is exactly what gets blurred in this kind of ships.
Yes. Well, on that note, on amity and maybe some erotics, please join me in thanking Santanu Das very, very warmly.